Good evening, everyone. Oh, that's great. Thanks for coming. And thanks especially to those of you who thought to wear a Major League Baseball cap. I've been enjoying seeing the different teams that are represented here. Unfortunately, no Royals are represented, which would have a certain meaning for some of us, but there are enough Boston Red Sox to make me feel good. So, welcome to the 2017 Silas Pierce Lecture. Silas Pierce was the treasurer of Boston University. I should probably mention who I am. I'm Ann Cudd. I'm the Dean of Arts and Sciences here at Boston University. So I'm lucky enough to be the host for the Silas Pierce Lecture. So Silas, back to Silas, was the treasurer of Boston University from 1911 to 1922, and he was also a university trustee way back from 1899 to 1922. And his heirs established a fund that bears his name, and they had the intention of providing special lectures at what was then called the College of Liberal Arts. I imagine that many of you are graduates of the College of Liberal Arts, which is now called the College of Arts and Sciences. The Silas Pierce Lecture was reintroduced at Boston University, and there was a hiatus, I'm not sure how long, but it was reintroduced just a couple of years ago in 2014. The series is open to all fields of inquiry covered in the College of Arts and Sciences, and somewhat beyond, as you'll see tonight, and is designed to highlight different fields across the years in featuring the broad range of fields and their intrinsic relevance to a broad public. The Silas Pierce Lecture demonstrates the continuing relevance and value of liberal education. So it's in this context that tonight I'm very pleased and honored to introduce my friend Bill James to deliver tonight's lecture. Bill's professional title is Senior Advisor on Baseball Operations for the Boston Red Sox, but he's also a prolific writer and an iconoclastic thinker. While he does not inhabit an academic institution or write about the kinds of topics that typically confer tenure upon professors, he's without doubt a public intellectual. And importantly for the Silas Pierce Lecture, his life's work illustrates the transformative power of a liberal arts education. Bill grew up in a small town in rural Kansas, but following the lead of an older sister and earning a place in a scholarship hall, he went to the University of Kansas, where he studied the liberal arts and majored in English and economics. Near the end of his 4 years, he was, I guess, the last person in Kansas to be sent to Vietnam. And when he returned, he found that he had actually graduated from KU. So Bill took a job as a night watchman at a pork and beans factory, which I admit hardly sounds like the beginning of a brilliant career. But nothing about Bill's life story is typical. In the quiet, late hours of the night in the canning factory, Bill pioneered what is now called sabermetrics, the statistical study of baseball, and started a subscription newsletter, probably what we would nowadays call a blog, that analyzed the game and its players, and eventually made him famous. His goal was to bring objective empirical evidence to the study of baseball, which was then full of more false, quirky, but stubbornly held ideas than there were baseball fans. The result was to significantly change how baseball is played, coached, and managed. Not to mention to bring a World Series championship finally to Boston after an 86-year drought. Bill's approach illustrates more broadly the power of data science to understand puzzles about everyday life. In 2006, Time named him in the Time 100 as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. I think of this as a liberal arts story because it illustrates how a broad range of disciplines can be brought to bear on virtually any practice to reveal new and deep insights that can, in turn, transform that practice. Bill brings a historical sensibility and a great deal of philosophical skepticism about conventional wisdom, along with some serious statistical thinking to a variety of subjects. Mostly baseball, but also crime, serial murderers, and university life, among others. Some of his books include the new Bill James Historical Baseball Abstract, Whatever Happened to the Hall of Fame, Baseball, Cooperstown, and the Politics of Glory, Win Shares, probably the thing he's most famous for in terms of statistics, and Popular Crime, Reflections on the Celebration of Violence. Although they reside in Lawrence, Kansas, where we were neighbors for many years, Bill and his artist wife, Susan McCarthy, also have connections to Boston and BU. Bill and his family moved to Brookline for a couple of years as he's worked for the Red Sox. And Susan, while here, completed a master's degree in art history in our Graduate School of Arts and Sciences during that time. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome them back to Boston. Bill's topic tonight is the arts and sciences of baseball. Please join me in welcoming Bill James.
Thank you, Ann. Mic working? I'll do a mic test by opening water, see if it... I wanted to thank Ann Cudd and Neil Becker for hosting us here. I wanted to thank Nancy Gertis for her help in arranging this, my wife, Susan McCarthy. I also wanted to thank Sarah Speltz. I wanted to thank Doug and Dave, whose last names I forgot to write down. But you are appreciated all the same. Thank you for your help in making this possible. My wife and I love Boston, and we love this neighborhood. But I'm always a little leery of coming here before Patriots Day. In fact, my usual rule is don't go to Boston before Patriots Day. I made an exception to that for this occasion, and I'm very glad I did, as yesterday was a lovely day, and it's the first time we've been to the opening day at Fenway in probably 8 years or so. It was great. I also walked around just a little bit in the rain today, and I actually enjoyed that. And I don't know why this is, but I noticed in 2002, when I started working with the Red Sox, that I actually enjoy walking in the rain in Boston. I don't know why. I never walk in the rain in Kansas. But there is something that's actually different about the rain here, not just the fact that you're in the streets in Boston, but there is something about the rain itself that's a little bit different here, that it's more like a spray than a shower. And I actually enjoy it. I don't know why. Okay, I wanted to talk today about what exactly it means to be an academic. I have some understanding of that, and I wanted to try to reach for a little better understanding of it. And I thought maybe this would be an appropriate place to do that. Some of you, I would guess, would be happy enough to be described as academics or scholars. I might describe you as scholars, but the term scholar has a slightly quaint resonance to it, and I'm guessing that if I described you as academics, you might not take offense at that. I would never describe myself as an academic because might be claiming skills that I don't actually have a right to claim. But people in baseball do think of me as an academic. They think, that Bill James, he's kind of an academic guy. He's not a bad guy, really, but he has a lot of peculiar ideas, but he's okay. He's just kind of an academic guy. So I'm an academic, but I'm not really an academic. So what is an academic? What does it mean to be an academic other than to be part of an academic institution? I see we're having a little issue with the mic that if I keep going like this, you hear me at one level, and if I look at you, I hear me at another. I'm going to try to looking at you this way, and we'll see how that goes. Just letting the sound guys go. I suppose I should stop for a minute and explain how I see what I have done for a living, since my view of what I do for a living is quite different than what most other people see the work that I've done. I can explain what made me who I am in just a few words. It's actually really simple. And it doesn't have anything at all to do with statistics. When I was a young person, all sports writing 100% of sports writing, began with a position on the issue. 100% of analytical sports writing. If a writer was writing about who should be the most valuable player, he would write that Dave Parker should be the most valuable player, or that Mike Schmidt should be the most valuable player, or that Dave Winfield should be the most valuable player. But he would start with a position on the issue, and he would find all of the evidence which supported that position. My thought was, let's start with the question itself rather than starting with a position on the issue. And that's the entire substance of what everything that I contributed to the field follows from that decision, to step back from what I was, from the beginning of the discussion, just a step or two. But when you begin with a question itself rather than beginning with a position on the issue, that leads to more questions. What is value for a baseball player? How do you decide who is more valuable if you don't start with a position on the issue? How do you decide what position you should take? What is the relationship between the value of offense and the value of defense? Who is really more valuable, a batter or a pitcher? How do you know? When you reach those questions, you realize that you don't know the answers. By this process, you start to see your own ignorance. When you start with a position on the issue, you work with the facts that are available to you, the facts that are in the public domain. When you start with the question itself, you run into black holes of ignorance, and where you realize that there are critical questions to which you don't have any idea what the answers are. What made my career meaningful to baseball was that I made baseball aware of the things that they did not know, and this started different trails of research. People started researching the questions that I had pointed out that we didn't know the answers to, and as a result of that research, we wound up knowing some things that we didn't know before. I often get credited with research actually done by other people, which is embarrassing, and I try to minimize that, but all I really did was find a great number of questions to which I did not know the answers. I also should say, not taking credit for things, I didn't actually go to Vietnam. I was drafted and I had orders to go to Vietnam, but they were canceled at the last minute, so don't want to understand that. I would certainly be happy to be, I would not be happy to be thought of as Vietnam veteran. I would certainly be happy to be thought of as an academic, but I would never apply that title to myself for the same reason I would never describe myself as a historian or a statistician. I write a lot about history, but I don't have the skills to be a real historian or an academic historian, and it would be a false claim if I were to run around claiming to be a historian. The same with an academic. It would be a false claim if I were to run around claiming to be an academic, from my standpoint. So then, what are the traits and skills that one has to have that make you truly an academic? One thing is that to be an academic, you have to be deeply committed to whatever it is that you study. I think on this scale that I'm okay. I think that I've probably studied my subject, baseball, as deeply and as seriously as almost anyone in the room has studied their own field of study. I'm addicted to baseball. When I'm not studying baseball, I'm doing something else connected with baseball, and it's all somehow connected to baseball. And I think on that scale, on the scale of being serious about what you're doing, I'm probably okay. I'm always trying to figure out something about baseball that I didn't know when I got up in the morning. How exactly, though, is that different from just being a baseball fan? There are an awful lot of people who love baseball and who know a great deal about baseball and who put a lot of time into baseball, but who could never be called academics. Every baseball professional tries to know as much about the game as he possibly can. The Red Sox first base and third base coaches are people who try to know as much about baseball as they can, but no one would describe them as academics. Or, on the other hand, there's one guy in every bar room in America who can list the starting lineup for the 1961 Yankees and the 1975 Red Sox and the 2010, 2012, and 2014 San Francisco Giants, and can tell you what everybody on those teams hit. But he's not an academic, he's just a drunk who likes baseball. What exactly is the difference between us? I'm going to stop and do a test to see. Can you all hear me? I know that everybody can hear me okay? All right. If you can't hear me, wave your hand. One thing that defines an academic, I think, is that an academic is primarily concerned with the ideas inherent in real things rather than with the objects themselves. If I were to sit down with the Red Sox third base coach, for example, and try to have a conversation about when he should send the runner and when he should hold up a stop sign, it would be difficult for us to have this conversation. First of all, he would know 100 times more about the subject than I would. I have an idea of which outfielders have strong arms and which do not, but I have a general idea. He would have very specific knowledge about each and every outfielder. And he would have built on that knowledge by having studied the video related to that outfielder before the series began. In the 1960s or 1970s, it was good enough for the coach to have a general idea about the throwing arm of each outfielder. But in 2017, it's different. Now, you really have to know. If the outfielder hasn't been throwing well since he dived for a ball in Toronto a couple of weeks ago, the coach now has to know that. The third base coach would have not only that kind of knowledge, but he would also know a wide variety of things about his runner. He would know how fast the runner was, but also he would know whether his runner tends to cut the base sharply or whether he tends to make a wide turn. He would know whether the runner was 100% at the moment or whether he's dealing with a leg injury. He would know whether the runner can slide well and to evade a tag or whether he can't. Whether he tends to watch the play and how early he tends to pick up the signal from the third base coach. I wouldn't know any of that stuff. My interests in discussion are rather different. I would be interested in questions like, when you are making a judgment about sending a runner, are you more interested in the outfielder's arm strength or are you more interested in his accuracy? What we call an outfielder's arm actually has several characteristics. There's arm strength, there's accuracy, there's speed of release. You need to know whether he throws rainbows or whether he throws on a flat level. And also, you need to know how fast he is in cutting off the ball, because while it's not exactly his arm, it's very relevant to whether or not, to the decision the third base coach has to make. The coach's real answer, I suspect, would be it's just instinct. The coach probably doesn't know whether the outfielder takes a 40-degree angle to the ball or a 50-degree angle or an 80-degree angle. He probably doesn't think of it in those terms. And he probably doesn't know whether he has 3 seconds or 5 seconds or 7 seconds to work with, but he has a finely honed instinct about how long that runner has to get to third base and how long it's going to take the throw to get to third base, and a finely honed instinct about how to put those together. And it would be difficult for me to discuss that with him because the things that I know, the things that I am interested in, are so different than the things that he knows that they would scarcely belong together. Also, I'm not that good at dealing with people, frankly. I'm not that good at meeting with people, and so I always have to be careful of whose toes I'm stepping on. I know John Farrell, and I like John Farrell, and he's never told me to stay away from people. We get along well, but I also don't want him I don't want him wondering whether I'm messing around in his business. I mean, he has his area and I have mine, and sometimes it's better if we just work that way. Okay, a second characteristic of an academic then is that an academic is interested in the ideas inherent in something rather than in the concrete realities of it. I'm like an academic in that I'm always more interested in what the ideas are that describe the situation rather than in the practical problems associated with it. Taking me a little while to catch up to my notes, sorry. I should also say that some of this will be different in the next generation. When I started studying baseball for a living in a serious way, I was living in Lawrence, Kansas, and working as a night watchman in a pork and beans factory. It's a long way from the people who run baseball teams. It's not that way anymore. Now, people who study baseball in a serious way deal with the practical day-to-day problems, with the people who deal with the practical day-to-day problems of the game on a day-to-day basis. And the distance between them is nowhere near as great, or will be nowhere near as great in the next generation as it was in my generation. But anyway, my point is that I'm like an academic in these two respects. But and here's a third way that I'm like an academic. I am perpetually and addictively trying to learn something, even if it has nothing to do with my profession. I'm one of those people who, no matter what we're talking about, will pull out a device that connects to the internet and start checking the facts about it. I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you guys are like that? Yeah, most of you are. All of the members of my family are like that, except my wife not as much, and she's the only true academic among us. But anyway, but all of my kids and kids-in-law are like that. They're all people who, if they're watching a movie about the 1970s and somebody mentions something that happened in the Ford administration, they will pull out their phones and start checking the facts related to that. I suspect that that's a characteristic that tends to be common among academics and probably not nearly as common among people in other areas. Excuse me a second. I have a son-in-law who is not a scholar in any sense. He's a very nice young man, but not in any sense an academic. But he can give you a long list of facts about every band which has had a hit in any genre since 1995. Sometimes when I speak for a long time, I develop a cough. I blame Hillary for this. She has the same problem sometimes. So I may have to pause in the middle of my talk and take questions, and that'll give my throat a little bit of a break. So we'll probably do that in the middle of the speech. I'm going to push on here for another minute, but I just wanted to warn the guys running the mic. In those three respects, then, I'm like an academic. One is that I work very hard at studying my subject. Two is that I'm always more concerned with the ideas inherent in something than the realities. And three is that I'm always trying to absorb knowledge. In what ways, then, am I not like an academic? Well, one is that I don't have the level of respect for the traditions of the field that I would have to have if I were having an academic career. I remember the first time I was assigned to write a term paper when I was in the 7th grade. I was writing a paper about Sandro Botticelli, and I referred to what is now believed to be a myth, that Botticelli worked in a stained glass factory as a young man, and that this influenced his work for the rest of his career. I gather that's not true. Anyway, it isn't in the encyclopedias anymore, but it was at that time. So I made a joke that it was fortunate that he hadn't worked in a pigsty as a young man. Well, I had worked in a pigsty the previous summer, cleaning them out, so it seemed like a natural thing for me to say. I didn't think it was anything alarming about it. But the teacher told me that was totally inappropriate, and I shouldn't say things like that in a paper. Had I been an academic type of personality, I suspect I would have paid attention to her. But being a writer, what I thought is, well, I got a reaction, I better do more of that. And I'm sure that when I wrote the next term paper, I probably made some even more appropriate joke. When I was a student at Kansas University, I had a class. I remember the professor was a lady named Myra Hinman. She's gone, so I can mention her name. I got the highest score on the test, on the class, on all 4 tests. She gave 4 tests. I had easily the highest scores on the test. But she gave me a B anyway, because she said that my paper showed a lack of seriousness in the subject. I can remember a dozen other times when writing papers, professors said things or did things to encourage me to be more serious in my approach. Excuse me. But I never paid any attention to them. And it's not that I rejected what they said. It's that on some level it didn't permeate. They just didn't work through to me. Something about it didn't fit with my natural makeup. I suspect what the old biddy meant to do was to wake me up and get me to pay more attention to the rules, but it had the opposite effect on me, and I was never a great student, to be honest. I've never been a lazy person, but I was kind of a lazy student. I was B-plus type student. And I think that one of the things that happened was that after that experience, I thought, well, there's no point in my trying to play this game because I'm just not good at it. So there's no point in my trying to follow our rules. I'm never going to be able to do it, so what difference does it make? I think that's one of the things that happened that caused my academic career to be less than, not that I wasn't in danger of flunking out or anything, but it was not a stellar academic career. If I'd wanted to go to Boston University in graduate school, I either couldn't, or maybe I could have, because Boston University at that time perhaps was not at the same level it is now. But anyway, I certainly couldn't have had the kind of undergraduate career that would have gotten me in here now. I'm going to have to go back to my notes for a little bit. By the way, I'll post my speech online if anyone wants to read it without the cough breaks. My way of thinking about, when I was writing a term paper, my way of thinking about the problem was that the teacher is grading a large stack of papers, and he or she is falling asleep as they're doing so, or in danger of falling asleep. And my main object is to wake them up. I just don't want them falling asleep on me. When I think about it, I realize that this is an illogical way to think about the problem. I mean, if the teacher is looking for things that you did wrong and is falling asleep on you, the last thing you should want to do is try to wake them up. You should let them sleep. But I didn't look at it that way. I looked at it the way a writer would look at it. We don't want people falling asleep on us. If I'm writing a paper, I want to keep you, writing anything, I want to keep you involved with it and connected to it. And if I have to say something outrageous in order to cause that to happen, I may say something outrageous. I won't say something that I know to be false, but as long as I don't know it to be false, I always look at things, I'm always more comfortable defending the idea that something may be true rather than it actually is true. And it could be true that Richard Nixon was a good man, or that Joseph Stalin was, I don't know. Well, if I have to defend Richard Nixon or Joseph Stalin in order to keep you from falling asleep, I may do that. I suspect that this is not a trait that academics share generally. I suspect that generally most of you are a lot more concerned with what is true than keeping people awake while they're reading their papers. I'm not saying you're wrong about that. That's just not me. I'm just the way I am. A writer indulges his ego in ways that I suspect are not popular in academia, and which actually are not popular in baseball either. In baseball, it is contrary to the ethics of the game to attract attention to yourself. I remember about 10 years ago, 60 Minutes did a profile of me. Morley Safer came down to Florida to spend a couple of days with me, and back up here, CBS crews filmed me walking around Fenway Park. People would see us coming down the sidewalk and they would dive to the other end of the sidewalk. It took some people 3 years before they would speak to me after that. As a writer, you generally cooperate with people who want to interview you or who are writing about you because it's just part of the job. But as a part of a team, you don't call attention to yourself. I suspect that as an academic, I would always be on the wrong side of this issue. I suspect that people would always say that I'm not a team player, or, well, there are less nice things that people say about people who are not team players. I have ways of defending myself against those attacks, but it's just the way I see the world. I just don't have the level of respect for tradition of the field that I would have to have if I were building an academic career. It's not just about making jokes, it has to do with respect for the field. Another way in which I'm not like a good academic is that I lack discipline. To a certain extent, this is a conscious choice on my part, or was a conscious choice on my part years ago. But also, to a certain extent, I regret it as a conscious choice. I have never been very good at making myself do things that I don't want to do. I don't think as a young man that I had any clear understanding of what discipline was, or any understanding of the value of it. Maybe young people never do, I don't know, but I certainly didn't. I more or less consciously rejected the idea of getting things done by forcing myself to do them, to do the stuff I didn't like. And I decided instead to focus my energies on doing the things that I enjoyed doing. In some ways, this has worked out great for me, but in other ways, such as my weight, this attitude has not been helpful. I wasn't a disciplined person when I was 20 years old, and I'm really not a disciplined person now, and in this way, I'm not like a good academic. When I look back at the things that I wrote 40 years ago, I can see that I was trying at that time to build an academic tradition in studying baseball in the way that I study it. All these years later, I can't really understand how I came to this position. This has succeeded beyond my wildest dreams, whether because of my efforts or just because just because of the time and the place. But in any case, my field of knowledge that I was trying to nurture now has a very robust level of activity, far beyond what I could ever have imagined. If you go back and read things that I wrote 30 and 40 years ago, it is clear that I anticipated that there would be such a field of knowledge, and that I spoke about it as if it existed, when in reality it hardly did. I can't understand now how it was that I was bold enough or arrogant enough to do that as a man in his 20s. In any case, there is a strong research tradition in my field now. I have great respect for the traditions of the field going forward from me. There are now 1,000 young men doing baseball research, which is in the general tradition of the work that I did years ago, and it is tremendously important for me to be respectful of their work and appreciative of their work, even when I don't understand it, which frankly is most of the time. But what you have to understand is that had there been such a field of research when I was a young man, I would have had to do something else. A few years ago, I spoke to a class over at Tufts, and there was a rude kid in the back of the room who kept kicking out remarks which I think were unconsciously designed to embarrass me. He would ask things like, "When was the last time you actually played baseball?" I think the professor who invited me to speak to the class, Andy Andrews, was kind of embarrassed, but I actually felt a certain level of affinity for the young man, and I wanted to give him as much space as I could to say what he had to say. That was me when I was a young man. In retrospect, I would have liked to have been a nice young man from a good family, and clean and handsome and fun-loving and always had a smile on his face. But I just wasn't. That wasn't me. I'm sure that would have been more fun, but I was the rude kid in the back of the class. Because I was that way, I don't know, I haven't seen that kid or heard from him in the 10 years since I spoke to Andy's class, but I'm sure that he has found multiple doors shut in his face since then, because people like us do. If there had been the tradition of research in our field then that there is now, I would have had to do something else because I would have felt, before I got to that point at which the door was slammed in my face, that it was going to be. I would have liked to be a baseball writer, a conventional baseball writer, the kind of guy who goes to teams and asks players after the game, what were you thinking before you hit that home run? I would have liked that and I would have enjoyed it, but I never felt that I could get that job. And 40 years later, I'm very certain that I could not have. I just was not cut out that way. I'm the kind of person who has to make up his own damn rules if I'm going to be able to get anything done. If I had tried to be conventional, I would have wiped out. I'll carry my notes for a little bit. I lived in Lawrence, Kansas at that time, and at those days, I still do at that time, Lawrence had a sports staff. They still have a newspaper, sort of. But in those days, the Kansas City Star had a sports staff of about 40 people. I would have liked to have been one of those people, but it just wasn't for me to be. There was one thing that I wanted to mention that Anne kind of alluded to in the introduction, which I think she picked up from having seen me speak before, which is the tremendous value that a liberal arts education has had for me. I know that in my years as a student, while I wasn't a good student, I know that if you divide my life into 4-year segments, I probably worked less hard in that 4-year segment than in any other 4-year segment. I wasn't expecting you to laugh there. And yet I know that despite the fact that I was not a hardworking student, I was not a good student, I know that I grew more, that I learned more, that I matured more, that I developed more in those 4 years than in any other 4 years of my life. And I don't really know how to explain that, other than to say that it's the miracle of a liberal arts education. That if you take a group of bright young men, young women, and expose us to ideas at that age, and sharing that process, that wonderful things will happen. I know a lot of people who say that their education never really mattered to them except that they had to have the degree. But I'm the exact opposite of that. My degree, honestly, has never meant very much to me. I've never had a resume in my life. I've never made a resume. I haven't applied for a job in 40 years, and the jobs I applied for were not the kind where they ask for a resume. They ask if you can work on Saturday. I didn't form friendships. I did form lifelong friendships in college, and I still have friends from that era. But I didn't meet my wife in college, or I didn't meet anyone who helped me get started in my field or anything like that. But if I had never gone to college, I would never have been exposed to the ideas of Adam Smith and Paul Samuelson and Milton Friedman and Robert Fogel and others. And I know for certain that I could never have done what I have done with my life if I had not had that experience. An academic is part of a long tradition of building knowledge and building understanding by sharing insights with one another. I believe in that process as deeply as any of you do. I believe that the world is vastly more complicated than the human mind, and that the only chance we have to understand things, to understand who we are, where we're going in life, is to work on problems together. I believe in this as much as any of you do, but I don't think I could have had a successful academic career because I just couldn't, as I said, I have to be that kind of person who makes up his own rules and goes about it in his own way. Another way in which I'm not like a good academic is that I never prepared myself properly as a young man with a solid grounding in scientific methods. I got the basic ideas of science, that is, that you take the discoveries of others and try to build on them, that you have to prove that each sentence that you say is true, and that even if you're an outsider, you can take the things that everybody knows to be true and they're subject not to the test of whether everybody believes they're true, but whether they fit the facts of the world. I got the basic ideas of science, but I never really had a strong grounding in scientific methods. I call the field of knowledge that I work in sabermetrics. This is how improbable my career is, but if any of you saw, my daughter watches something called Bob's Burgers, which I don't watch. Lead character is a guy named Bill Haber, I guess, and he was talking in the last show about his how he measured his success in his life, and he said, "I call it Habermetrics." Sorry, I missed that. When I was young and arrogant enough, and thinking through what sabermetrics should become, one of the goals that I had for the field was that we should always be people who talk to the world at large rather than people who talk to one another and who develop our own language. I totally lost that battle with the world. I mean, sabermetrics now is full of its own lingo, and the people who do sabermetrics mostly talk to one another and ignore the rest of the world. I don't think that it's in the best interest of academia to do that. I think it's in the best interest of academia to speak a common language so that you can have influence on the discussions of the rest of the world. Ms. Cudd was telling me about a program that they have called the 3-minute dissertation, where a student has 3 minutes to defend their dissertation and one slide. I think that's genius. I think that's a great idea to do that, because if you're asking the student to boil it down to what do you really know, what use is it to anybody, I think that there's a great value in that kind of thing. Well, I lost my battle with the world in that sense, but in another sense, I won my battle with the world. That I believe that there was value in approaching baseball questions by looking not to the players for answers, but by looking to the facts, by looking to the records. And I went through a long period where very few people seemed to accept that principle. But I won that argument with the world. The number of people who have adopted my way of thinking about problems in baseball turned out to be vastly larger than I would ever have believed that it would be. That's what I mean by saying I won my argument with the world, and it was education that enabled me to do that. So I'm thankful for that opportunity, and I'm thankful for this opportunity to speak for you today, and thankful for the opportunity to take your questions, I'm also thankful that my cough held off long enough to get me to the end of the speech. But before I close, I have to wedge in a commercial break. I have a book coming out this fall. It's not about baseball. The book is called Man from the Train. It tells a truly horrible story about a murderer who lived 100 years ago. I was talking earlier in the talk about making jokes in my papers, but there are very few opportunities for humor in The Man from the Train, because the story is simply so dark that it would be difficult to say anything funny without being disrespectful. This is my second book in the true crime genre, but what I do in crime books is, to me, exactly the same thing that I've always done in baseball. I back off from what it is that we think we know and try to ask basic questions about the subject. What I was always trying to do in baseball was to move the discussion. A lot of discussions in baseball are circular. If you read MVP arguments from 1970 or from 1935, they're the same arguments. You just change the name and the argument is just the same. I was trying to throw enough hard facts under the tires to give the discussion traction and to enable it to move forward. That's what I'm trying to. Crimes are terribly important events. They are life-shaping events to the people who are involved in them in any way, and they're important events to the culture at large. Our public discussion on them is pitiful. Our public discussion of the crime problem in general is a pitiful discussion. What I'm trying to do in crime books, the same as I did in baseball, is to move the discussion forward. Trying to push it forward, just trying to throw enough facts under the wheels to get the discussion to move forward. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to do that. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you tonight. And if you have any questions, please approach somebody with a microphone or ask somebody to toss you. Oh, I think I forgot to thank you. Did I forget to thank you? Sarah, I think I forgot to thank Sarah at the start of the speech. And, okay. I did? You did. I did forget. You thanked. Oh, well, forget to cancel the second thank you. All right, if you have any questions, ask Doug or Sarah, and I will be happy to take your questions.
We will bring the microphone to you, and if you can wait for the microphone because we're recording this, we'd like to get your question as well. So raise your hand if you have one.
If you right now were to go back to you as a child, probably my age, and tell yourself that you would have the job that you got, would you be happy?
Oh, I'd be thrilled. I'd be thrilled beyond belief. I'm so fortunate. My father was a school janitor. I never thought I'd have a good job. And to have the jobs that I've had, it's just a wonderful thing. Anyone? Yes, sir. The question is twofold. Do I think, I'm assuming some of you may not have heard, do I think that a good metric will be developed to evaluate managers? And the second part is, do you think the StatCast data will be incorporated into managerial decisions on a minute-to-minute basis? Is that accurate? All right. With regard to managers, that's a really good illustration of what I meant by trying to move the discussion forward. I realized that the discussion about managers was one of the worst discussions in sports because it didn't go anywhere. People would say, he's a genius, he's an idiot, he's a genius, he's an idiot. That was the whole discussion. And I realized that what I could contribute to this would be to try to figure out how one manager was different from another. So I started counting things like how many different lineups does he use in the course of a year, how many times does he start the runner, and making a year-to-year record of those things. That involved not evaluating managers, not saying, here's a metric. And I have been committed to that process for 20 years. Yes, I think people in the future will have a better understanding, some better way of measuring whether a guy's a good manager or not. But I would always encourage you not to focus too much on it and to focus on understanding first how it is that one manager, some managers are really good at working with people, and some are Bobby Valentine. Sorry about it. I would encourage you to focus on that. As to the data being used, yes, it is being used already some. For example, there's a lot of work being done now on where you should position the fielders, and that's from the StatCast data, and they work out, we think the odds are the ball will be hit here, so we'll put the fielders here. That is being done now. I do think that there will be more of that over time and that the loop will get shorter, but there's so much data there that we're just buried. People are just buried in the data, and it will take a long time for us to dig ourselves out.
We had a question back here.
I see you came to the Red Sox in 2002.
I did, yes, sir.
And did you cross paths with the Billy Beane when he was offered that kind of money from the Red Sox? And how is there any correlation between you and Billy Beane and how you look at baseball?
I know Billy, and I've done events with him a few times. But I didn't cross paths with him at that time, no. To the best of my knowledge, the scene in Moneyball, which shows Billy talking to John Henry, to the best of my knowledge, that's accurate. I asked John if it was accurate, and he said he didn't think that guy looked that much like him. But generally, I think that's the way it's told in Moneyball is pretty accurate. I didn't personally cross paths with him. Yes, sir.
speaking about your methodology, I'm curious how you compare it to the sort of scientific process of starting with an idea and then testing it and either proving it or disproving it or creating a better idea as a result. Your process sounds a little bit different than that, so I'm just wondering if you could compare
No,
that.
I have imitated the scientific methodology as best I am able to do, given my limited training in scientific methods. Again, I can't claim to be a scientist because I might be making a false claim, but I have always tried to use scientific methods to the best of my ability. Yes, sir.
I'd like the correlation between your work on cotton and your work on baseball. Baseball, you did great work because there was this massive unexamined statistic that exists in baseball that you put together in a meaningful way.
Right.
You're doing the crime book, saying you want to do the same thing, and yet the crimes have all kinds of, the facts are generally out there, particularly if there's been a trial. And for a 100-year-old case, what's left to discover that's unexamined that you can bring the technique to?
Well, it looks a lot different because of the nature of the information you work with, but the intellectual process, I think, it seems to me to be a lot the same. It's finding the question. What you're trying to do is find the question which will move the understanding of the event and find the answer to that question. And your understanding of large events is connected to, and to an extent based on your understanding of tiny little events. And what we do in baseball is accrue knowledge of tiny little events to such an extent that they eventually inform the large events. But you don't want to focus on the little stuff and but you have to ask yourself the big questions too. I mean, if you want to really, the much greater writer who has my name, William James, writes about connecting the little questions to the big questions. And to me, that's a very powerful concept, that in order to organize the discussion, you have to learn to understand the relationship between the big questions and the little questions, and you have to find some way to draw a line between them. You also have to understand that when you do draw that line between them, you're going to get something wrong. We're never exactly right. When we make that connection between the little issues and the big ones, we get something wrong. But that's still essential to building understanding.
We have a question here.
Yes.
I appreciated your distinction between taking a stand on an issue and asking a question as to what is the issue. But I think you might be almost overly self-effacing when you kind of explained your success in creating a field of knowledge to brashness. I mean, you acknowledged elsewhere that you anticipated a need. So I guess I'm wondering, as a kind of aspiring academic and writer, once you have these sort of questions, how do you go about finding an audience?
The first thing you have to do, that's a really good question, I appreciate it. The first thing you have to do in building an audience for a new field of knowledge is to force yourself to pay no attention to your critics. It's hard to do that because there's an established way of thinking about everything, most of which is never examined and just grew up over time and it's just there. You have to force yourself, but when you write about something new, you will wind up saying, that's nonsense. I don't know why people believe that, but it's not right. And the people in that field will train their guns on you. And you have to learn to screen them out, not being disrespectful to them. Maybe I was disrespectful, I don't know. That was easy for me. I mean, I'd been taking shit all my life. It wasn't a problem for me. One reason I wound up where I am is that it was easy for me to take that kind of criticism and ignore it, but it's hard for a lot of people to do that. Yes, sir.
James, thank you. I really appreciated what you said earlier about beginning with questions themselves rather than a position, and how you said by this process you start to see your own ignorance. And to me, that is the value of a liberal arts education, and I can't help but hear those words through my ears of today and of our current moment, which I think you're also talking about. So my question to you is when you say that we should be people who talk to the world, and this idea of William James of not losing sight of the bigger questions. We've seen the dimensions of baseball remain the same, but the industry of baseball and the industry of sports and the ability of all of us to go deeper and deeper into the smaller questions. I'm wondering if you've moved the conversation into a deeper direction. I'm wondering if you, with your interest in law and crime, are now interested in moving it elsewhere.
The baseball research has gotten so far ahead of me that I'm old. I have a hard time keeping up. And there's still one thing that's hard for you. You're right about ignorance. One thing that's hard for a young person to do is to learn to value ignorance. The thing is that ignorance is all around us all the time. There's lots of ignorance. And whenever you can find people saying something that isn't true, you can make money off that. I mean, I don't mean just make money, but you can build your reputation by proving that that's not true. And there are opportunities to do that all the time, all around us. So I just reached a point at which what I was doing in baseball, I still work in that area, and I still try to contribute where I can. But the younger people are a lot more sophisticated in terms of technique and stuff than I am. So I'm trying to get people to think a little more clearly about famous crime stories.
I'm going to switch back to baseball.
Yeah.
People who have taken up your method use a lot of statistical evidence. Has the steroid era affected the material that they're working from?
Well, the steroid era is a great monkey wrench, of course. However, the first thing we do in sabermetrics is make everything relative to everything else, right? So it really affects us, in a sense, less than it does everybody else, because it's normal. Whereas a fan, the drunk in the bar that we were talking about earlier, he expects standards to be the same across an era and is disturbed when the standards change. But we never expect that to begin with. We adjust everything immediately. So in a sense, it affects us less than it does everybody else, I think. Would you agree with that, Andy? Oh, thanks. Yes, sir.
Hi. I'm curious what it was about baseball that you thought made it particularly susceptible to your style of analysis, and how you think that analysis, I think we're seeing it a little bit in other sports, but how you think it's transferable or is accepted in other sports?
Well, baseball is a very, very orderly game. I mean, the players take turns batting. I mean, in basketball, the players, they don't take turns shooting, you know. They stop at base 1 or base 2 or base 3, and when there are 3 outs, they stop. It's a very orderly game, and it had records back 100 years from where I started. So this thing's made it perfect for me. But you're presenting that as if it was a rational decision. I was just a kid. I didn't make rational decisions. I loved baseball. I was an obsessive baseball fan, and I worked about baseball because it's what I loved, what I cared about. Have I answered you? Oh, it's whether because of me or not, I don't know. But it has spread everywhere. There is a Bill James of everything. The people who work in basketball are actually really good, and in some ways they're more sophisticated than we are, because they have to be to deal with the fluid mechanics of the game. The game is changing so rapidly that it's really tough to sort things out. But the basketball analysts are really good. The Celtics have been ahead of the curve on that for a long time. When I lived here 10 years ago, the Celtics had an analytical guy, a really smart guy, Mike Zarin, who was there every day working with them. He doesn't get a lot of publicity. He and I used to go to breakfast out in Worcester, talk about stuff. But basketball analytics particularly are really smart. In football, a lot of it was done inside the business by the coaches. They were studying films a long time before I came around, so a lot of good analysis had been done before I started doing baseball. Yeah.
Oh, all right. So you talked a lot about like sabermetrics in the outside world to an extent, and then within the greater sabermetrics community now, it seems like, or it doesn't seem like it is, that there's been a sort of brain drain from the publications to the teams now. It's becoming more and more centralized
Yes.
and less democratized.
Yes, that's right.
The last major public breakthrough was probably what, pitch framing, something along those lines. Do you think, and this is sort of a meta question, do you think that is a bad thing for the academic tradition you've created, that the data is becoming more and more proprietary and that it's not as democratized? And do you think there's a way to further democratize it, or is that even a desirable goal?
What you describe as happening certainly is happening. You're right about that. The people who, now lots of young people write blogs or contribute to blogs and they get hired by teams. And when they do that, they make a living. Not a bad thing at all. That's a good thing, make a living doing this. So in a sense, it's a great thing. It does create problems for the academic institution. The academic institution, if they're not careful, there's some fields, and if I say, this is probably wrong, so just ignore me. But there's some fields like chemistry in which Dow Chemical spends $1 billion a year or $10 billion a year or something doing research, and they're not going to publish what they do. So it is a constant challenge for the chemist to stay up to date, and it's a constant fight. There are other fields where that's not as much true. We are transitioning toward that being a field in which it's more true, and it's guys making a living, that's great. I'm glad they are. Yeah.
With the proliferation of sabermetrics to the point where every team has their own department with multiple analysts, is there still a way for small market teams to win now that that competitive advantage may have dried up?
I mean, yes, there is. First of all, small market teams need to take advantage of the ignorance in the game, and there is never a shortage of ignorance. Seriously, there will always be stupid stuff that people believe that you can gain an advantage by not believing it. That's no less true now than it was 15 years ago. Also, there's an inherent conflict between a wealthy organization and an organization that looks for small edges. With the Red Sox, and I'm awfully glad that we're a wealthy organization, but it does, the fact is that we can win without always being on the right, we can win by doing conventional things. Kansas City can't win by doing conventional things. They have to find edges. So yeah, there's very much a place for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to. Oh,
yes. I decided a long time ago that I was writing about the real game and not the fantasy game, and I would just stay with that. And I don't. Also, when I started working with the Red Sox, we were banned from playing those fantasy games. So I still don't play them and don't play them and don't pay attention to them. So
We have time for one more question.
we have
right
time
here.
for one more question.
Yep, he's right here.
I guess I win. Bill, I have a question for you, and I apologize that this is not baseball, but as a Philadelphia native who's followed the Eagles, Phillies, and Flyers, one thing that's astonished me is the remarkable success of the New England Patriots. I wish you could comment on that, perhaps to talk about whether is this a case where their data analytics is just so far superior to every other team, or do you sense intuitively that there's more to it? I'm curious if you can comment on that.
I think they're a smart organization, and around the country, a lot of people are not fond of the Patriots. I don't know if you know that. And legends about the Patriots pushing the envelope with regard to ethical practices permeate the culture. I don't know that there's that much to it. I think they're mostly a smart organization, and that they're probably strong enough and hard-hearted enough to do what is reasonable, even if it's hard, I think. I'm going to try to sneak in one more question.
Yeah, it's going to be David's because he's the chair of my largest department.
All right.
I'm going to ask a non-academic question. I wondered if you could comment on your experience as a fan. Being a fan means shouting at the TV or shouting at the field about that bonehead decision that somebody made.
Right.
And you've changed the decisions that players make and the coaches make. And I wonder if your experience as a fan has become more satisfying and less complaining, or if the bar just keeps going up.
Well, with the Red Sox, we don't, when you're sitting with the executives, you don't cheer, and you can't boo the umpire. There's really a good reason why it's that way. And I actually found that to be sort of relaxing. I mean, you go to a game, you expect to cheer and boo and stuff. But not being able to do that, I found is kind of relaxing. However, like yesterday, I went to the opening day with my wife, and we were sitting out in right field, and nobody would have known who I was. So, I can boo the umpire, which I find to be a tremendous relief. I go to KU basketball games, and booing the referees is one of the things I enjoy most. And I'm the loudest booer in my neighborhood, just for the exact reason you ask. That I can't normally do that, so I do it when I can.
Okay, on that non-academic note, first of all, let me thank you all for coming and for your great questions. It's been a lot of fun. And now please join me in thanking Bill James.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.